Hello viewers, today we will be discussing the topic the state and economy. This is an area of discussion both for political scientists as well as economists. There have been a lot of debates and deliberations on the relative role and importance of the state in the economic system and what is the role of the economy in sponsoring state. However, students, we need to understand there is an emerging scholarship in the field of economic sociology trying to understand the relationship between the two from a different perspective. Recent work in economic sociology and related fields have challenged the familiar terms for analyzing the relationship between state and economy that have dominated much of the social science literature since the times of Adam Smith. Contemporary scholarship has challenged the assumption put forth by both the advocates as well as the critiques of market allocation, which stated that the state and market are distinct and opposing modes of organizing economic activity. This module will actually focus on the interrelationship between the state and economy from the perspective of economic sociology, which is an important and emerging field of study for state and economy. This module will basically focus on two substantive areas. First, the relationship between state and economy on transitional and developing societies. And secondly, from the perspective of advanced industrial welfare states. Let us start off with the contemporary scholarship on this issue. Fred Block and Peter Evans, in their work The State and Economy, published in the Oxford Handbook of Economic Sociology, has advanced three general propositions. Number one, state and economy are not analytically autonomous realms, but are mutually enforcing constitutive spheres of activity. Second, both states and economies are embedded in societies that have specific institutional structures, and this embeddedness plays a critical role in both economic and political life. Third, this embedding is dynamic. It is often reshaped by institutional innovations that reshape the ways the states and economies interact with each other. Now, which is more important, the state or the economy? Since a long time, debates on the relationship between economy and state have centered on a single question: how large or small a role should the state play in the economy? Implicit in that question is the dubious assumption that the state and economy are separate analytical spheres that can function autonomously. This is erroneous. The state and economy should be seen as mutually constituting spheres of activity, neither of which can function without the other. States obviously depend on the economy for the flow of revenue that finance state activity. The states cannot function without a sound economic system. This dependence helps explain why purely predatory forms of government rule are relatively rare. Even the greediest of all governments tend to learn that without placing limits on their predation, production will contract because people need some sort of assurance that they will be able to retain some fruits of their labor. This reciprocal case for mutual dependence is mostly contested. The economy's dependence on the state tends to be flatly denied by free market advocates who argue that market economies function best with minimal government interference. That government is the best that interferes the least. Let us move on now to the interdependence between state and economy. Economic sociologists, as I have said a little earlier, have contested and challenged this claim by arguing that even the most market-oriented economies depend on legal and political structures provided by the state. Weber, for example, argued that the unique form of rational capitalism that became dominant in Western Europe depended heavily on the effectiveness of laws of property and contract designed to ensure that profits were generated primarily through productive activity rather than through parasitical extractions. Another very important economist in this claims that Karl Polanyi deepened Weber's argument in this context by showing that market economies rely on three critical inputs that cannot be supplied through market activity alone. They are land, labor, and capital. Karl Polanyi used the term fictitious commodity to characterize land, labor, and money because economic theorists must pretend that these items were produced for sale on the market in the same way as other goods. However, we need to understand that labor is simply the activity of human beings. Land is nature divided into different parts. And the money that circulates in national economies almost always relies on the full faith and credit of one or the other government. In all these three cases, the necessary activity of regulating the supply of these fictitious commodities are dependent on the government that encompasses different activities. For instance, regulating the supply of money, for example, includes the creation of a viable currency which is acceptable in the market, central banks monitoring currency, and oversight over banks and other financial institutions that shape the supply of credit. So here the state has an important role in money circulation. Secondly, adjusting the supply of labor includes policies made by the state that influence the immigration and out-migration of people, education, technology, policies, social welfare policies designed to provide resources to households and individuals with sufficient employment opportunities, as well as income. Finally, we need to understand that the managing the supply of land also encompasses government regulations, planning, environmental protection, transportation policies, farm policies, and other types of land use planning. Therefore, we can safely conclude that the three assets, land, labor, capital, though are used by the market, are controlled by the state. Now, we need to understand from this that there is an embeddedness between the state and the economy. Neither can work without the other. The idea of mutual constitution of state and economy is often expressed in the shorthand that economies are embedded within social and political structures. The intention here is to deepen the embeddedness argument by clarifying in what the economy is actually embedded in both the political system as well as the societal system. We also have to give due regard to the work by Fred Bloch and Peter Evans, who argue that market economies are embedded within a civil society that is both structured by and in turn helps structure the state. They further argue that the market economies are embedded within the civil society that is both structured by and in turns they also help structuring the state. Basically, we need to understand that the state and economy is embedded in the civil society. Civil society encompasses both the variety of non-governmental associational activities from trade organizations and fraternal organizations, for example, trade unions, protest movements, political parties which constitute the public sphere in which citizens form their political preferences. So there is a connection between the state, economy, and civil society which we can hardly disregard. There is considerable variation among societies both in the density of the associational life, that is how much role the civil society plays in the polity and economy, and in which the civil societies are structured. In this connect, it is imperative to mention the name of Robert Putnam, who had played an important role in understanding and analyzing civil society in European societies and their impact on state and economy. But civil society is deeply penetrated by law and other governmental practices. Both the structures and responsibilities of trade unions or trade associations, so as to say, are significantly shaped by legal rules and institutional patterns of interactions with government officials. Trade unions cannot work unless they are sanctioned by the government and the state. Yet, ideally, civil societies retain sufficient autonomy from the state to place significant limits and constraints on the exercise of governmental authority. As many theorists have insisted that the viability of governmental institutions rests ultimately on the capacity for political mobilizations and citizens. Thus, the state cannot ignore the role of the civil society. There is no guarantee that such interplay between the state, economy, and civil society will move automatically from one functioning variety of capitalism to another. Societies can suffer extended periods of institutional crisis in which any new initiatives are blocked by stalemate by competing forces, and that they can also experiment with policy directions that are ultimately abandoned and because they lead nowhere. We also need to understand that it is in this context that Polanyi sought to characterize the dynamism by arguing that market societies are continually being reshaped by two conflicting movements. They are the movement for laissez-faire, to expand the scope of markets, and secondly, the movement for social protection to limit the scope of the market forces. How can we understand the relationship between the state and the market? Let us try to understand this relationship through Polanyi's double movement framework. The movement for laissez-faire often demands the expansion and enforcement of the property rights of wealth holders, while the opposing movement frequently centers on securing social rights. Polanyi suggests that both of these movements operate through institutional innovations. The New Poor Law in England in 1834 was a triumph of the movement for laissez-faire. We already know that. It sought to institutionalize a free labor market by eliminating outdoor relief and establishing the poorhouse as the only alternative to paid employment. Polanyi's critical insight was that even those who insist that all they want is to allow markets to work depend upon state power and institutional structures to achieve these ends. The market cannot work without the state. Shortly after the New Poor Law was enacted, the other movement passed the Factory Act that placed limits on the length of the working day and established a system of factory inspectors. In short, both the movements changed the way labor markets worked and the fact that the labor markets were embedded, and both altered the interface between the civil society as well as the state. Now, there have been a number of criticisms of Polanyi's double movement framework. Now, it probably overstates the strength of the movement for laissez-faire within some of the non-Anglo-Saxon varieties of capitalism, and the idea of expanding the scope of the market is problematic because all market organizations or arrangements require some kind of restrictions on who is allowed to do business and what can be bought or sold in the market. Nevertheless, we need to understand that Polanyi's formulation is extremely useful in conveying the idea that there are several dynamics at play to change the ways economic activities are embedded within the societal and the state system. Now, let us move on to the three embeddedness of the state, market, and the civil society. The key point that we need to understand is that this entire embeddedness occurs through some institutional structures and innovation. Without institutions, embeddedness of the market and civil society cannot happen. Sometimes this occurs largely on the terrain of the civil society through the creations of new associations and institutions intended to organize or coordinate different forms of economic activity. But even if these cases, the new forms are to endure, they have to be supported and legitimized by the state. Other times, the initiatives comes through the state or by way of cooperation between the different actors of the state and the different actors of the civil society. But all these innovations tend to reconfigure the state-economy balance. Now, can we say that the state-economy relationship has been successful? Rather than seeing economic success as rooted in particular configuration of states and markets, we emphasize the importance of the capacity for institutional reconfiguration to explain why some societies have been more successful than others in solving their political and economic problems. In sum, this perspective offers a way to escape the familiar and often sterile debate between adherents of the free market on the one hand and the advocates of strengthening the state system and governmental regulations and public provisions on the other. It directs attention to the qualitative issues of how and for what ends markets and state should be combined and what structures and practices in civil society will sustain a productive synergy of the state and the market. Let us now try to understand the relationship between state and economy with the help of some examples of developing societies and developed societies. The great success stories of development pursued by East Asian economies like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan cannot be explained either by reliance on free market or state-sponsored accumulation. So what is the success behind these states? The developmental state must itself be understood as an institutional innovation whose success is explained by an integrated relationship between state, economy, and civil society. But recently, development and transition studies scholars have increasingly focused on the more numerous cases of failure. Since the last 25 years, many countries have experienced disappointing growth rates and significant reduction in the provision of essential public goods to the disadvantaged segment of the society. But here as well, the most promising prospects for improvement centers on institutional innovations that engage civil society in the reconfiguration of economic governance. What about developed societies? The contemporary dilemmas of advanced industrial societies demand a similar kind of analysis. Here, the argument has centered on the welfare state, with market liberals insisting that the overdeveloped system of public provision in West European countries have caused slower growth, higher unemployment rates experienced by much of Europe as compared to United States of America in the past 20 years. On the other side, defenders of the welfare state concept have argued that generous public provision has played a very important role in the Rhenish variety of capitalism that has produced higher standards of living among the American states. Coming back to our discussion into how these concepts, this embeddedness, institutional innovations have worked in transitional and developing societies. Development transforms political, economic, and social structures, creating new bases for productivity, ideally enabling people to lead lives that they have reason to value, according to Amartya Sen. Defined in this way, development is the typical problem for theories of both state and economy. That development is first and foremost a need for institutional transformation rather than simply growth or the accumulation of capital is now an accepted theorem. Polanyi exemplifies an institutional perspective on the dynamics of development in the respect of European markets. For Polanyi, the road to free market in England was opened and kept open by an enormous increase in continuous, organized, and controlled interventionism. So there was an active state intervention at work. In short, the construction of the free market was an institutional innovation that required an active involvement of the state. So free market cannot operate without the state. Lacking individual capitalists who would be able to assume risk at the scale required by modern technology, these countries depended on the state not just to construct markets but to serve as investment bankers and to bear entrepreneurial risk. So the state is needed in developing countries to bear the capitalist risk. The state could help induce private capitalists to play their role not only by supplying infrastructure but by building confidence among individual entrepreneurs that their initiatives were part of a general mutually reinforcing set of investment options and decisions. State investment in essential modern infrastructure was combined with subsidies and selective protectionism against external competition. The big difference, as it has been noted, the ability of the state to make its support contingent on local elites, creating internationally competitive industrial capacities. And if you have noticed, developing countries mostly went for a mixed economic pattern. Turning from developing to transitional countries, one might expect a very different set of findings and conclusions. Whereas relative insulation from global markets was one of the primary defining features of the state socialist countries that we now call them transitional, the states and the social structures of the global south are the product of centuries of integration into the capitalist world economy. The extent to which experience of transitional countries reinforces conclusions drawn from developing cases is therefore striking and exemplar. If we look into one of such transitional societies, Russia. Russia was one of the most important and leading transitional case studies which demonstrated the pitfalls of trying to implant market without thinking carefully about how they will connect with existing states and social structures. Terrified that the Soviet party state would somehow survive, Russian reformers and their Western patrons tried to impose the formalities of Western market rules as quickly as thoroughly as possible in Russia. The result is not just disappoint from the point of view of preserving social protection, they also failed to deliver productivity enhancing economic transformation and produced perverse effects in terms of effective legal norms and social order. China and Vietnam supply contrasting cases suggesting that constructing innovative institutional hybrids based on local social structures makes for a more effective transition. China and Vietnam further show that the market disciplines and incentives can be a source of new dynamism in systems that has been dominated by an overbearing state apparatus. But it is critical to note that the old state apparatus continue to supply enough discipline over market actors to prevent the emergence of a mafia-style predatory capitalism as in Russia. The concept of state and economy in welfare states needs to be studied. In developed societies, debates over welfare states closely parallel arguments over the optimal developmental strategy for developing and transitional societies. On the one side, market liberals insist that state provision of welfare interferes with effective functioning of markets. On the other, proponents of the welfare state development model focus on the negative social and political outcomes where society depend on market processes alone to allocate income. But for more than a century of this debate, both critics and advocates of welfare state perspective have shared the underlying premise that states and markets are analytically separate domains and they are autonomous in their own sphere. In the 1970s, this shared dualism produced some point of convergence in the arguments put forth by the market liberals and left-wing defendants of the system. For example, the market theorists argued that an excess of democracy has led politicians to expand welfare state activity, expanding beyond sustainable levels and requiring significant cutbacks to restore the economic health of the country. Analysts on the left argued that the conflicting logic of legitimization and accumulation has produced an unsustainable expansion in public provision that necessitated either severe retrenchment or a definitive break with the logic of capitalism. Welfare state funding should not be treated simply as a cost that is imposed on the economy, but it should be regarded as a key input in the economic processes. In the contemporary Westphalian state model, the relationship between the state and economy can no longer be confined to the nation-state level. With the emergence of multi-level governance structure, the relationship between state and economy has also taken transnational positions. The multi-level dynamics of state and economy play themselves in different ways in different regions of the world. In the South, for example, global market and global governance looked like institutional innovations controlled by others long before cross-border ties were seen as globalization. The states of the North have a different relation with state and economy. In addition to their economic and political military powers, these individual states exercise a disproportionate share of control over global governance institutions. The emergence of global markets has fundamentally depended on the creation of an impressive array of new multi-level international governance institutions. Consequently, centering debate around the question, which is better, more state or more market, is a theoretically sterile approach. In fact, both for developing and developed societies, the state and the market is equally essential. Development has always required active involvement of the state, but the states have also been deeply implicated in decay and stagnation, so you cannot rely on the state only. Success depends not on finding some magical balance between state and economy, but on constructing institutions that enable productive interaction between state structures, market institutions, and the civil society. Thank you.